There is a pretty serious global censorship plan on the horizon. And it's really very concerning because the timing of this whole plan in New York is, quote, coincidental with the United Nations plan to regulate social media and online communication.
I'm Stephanie Keith.
And I am Tara Manjekovic, and we are unapologetically outspoken.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. All right. Today, we've got another interesting topic for you. So we've talked a lot about the issue of illegal migrants in New York City. I know this is like a big topic for you, Tara. And Mayor Adams has stated, multiple times that they don't have enough resources to deal with the issue. And they've cut back on pretty much every government service to take care of these illegal migrants instead of taking care of the American citizens and the New York taxpayers. But now they're even starting to cut back into basic services like funding for sanitation and police, all in order to house migrants in swanky hotels and pay for their every need.
Yeah, I just want to tell you the latest move as of last weekend. They are closing libraries on the weekend because the city can't afford to staff them. And Mayor Adams is now urging the wealthy residents of New York to start funding the city's financial crisis through philanthropy. He gave a press conference on Tuesday where he warned that migrants are going to have to start sleeping on the street because the city's budget crisis is so bad that they have to cut the cost of housing migrants by 20%. And he also announced that the city is going to be canceling its next 5 police academy classes. So the already very understaffed police department and the underserved members of New York City are going to be even more fucked.
Okay, and what do you think is going to happen when these people are on the street and can't get a job because they don't have their paperwork and everything else? They're going to resort to crime. So
Right.
there's going to be a crime spike. Well, despite the fact that, New York has no funds left, the state of New York is spending $75 million to surveil its citizens on social media. In an Epoch Times article, Governor Kathy Hochul is quoted as saying, quote, "We're very focused on the data we're collecting from surveillance efforts. We have launched an effort to be able to counter some of the negativity and reach out to people when we see hate speech being spoken about on online platforms," end quote. So let's just let that sink in for a minute. They want to watch what you're posting on social media and have police, quote, reach out if it's labeled as negativity. This is a police state. It's literally what they do in communist China. And let's be real. We know already that they're watching what we do on social media. Thanks to the Twitter files, we know that the government was actively censoring people and working hand in hand with social media companies. But this is taking things to the next level because they're saying that not only are they going to watch, but they are going to have police reach out. It's just crazy to me. They actually, are saying that they have their smart strategy, let's call it, to get people on board with this is that they're saying that this is all due to the rise in anti-Semitic threats. So that's how they're going to get people to buy into it. Oh, well, we're just going online and monitoring people that are threatening, Jewish people. Well, according to a Washington Times article, the New York Police Department said that there was a 214% increase in hate crimes against Jewish residents. Man, I can't talk today. In October of this year compared to October of last year. So they're amping it up. This is how they're getting people to just allow the government to surveil you on social media. They're going to get everyone's buy-in. And this is where we can't be fooled by this. Having the government get more control and having government surveillance is never a good thing because once they have that power, they're not going to give it up. And they will use it to take down anyone that goes against their agenda or anyone that questions the government. And I just want to point out that this is the fundamental difference between the left and the right. I think that there's so much chatter, people think it comes down to whether you're pro-choice or pro-life, or like where you stand on gender affirming care for minors. But the fundamental core difference has to do with power and control. The left wants more government interference, more regulations, more power and control at every level. The right wants less government involvement, less regulations, and more individual control. And, once again, like when the government gets more control, they never give it back, ever. So, like, they're going to use the Israel Hamas conflict to start surveilling everyone. But make no mistake, like they are going to use this from here on out in any way that they deem necessary to maintain power and control over the public, to push their narrative. Like, just imagine during COVID what they would have done with this. And so, like, my big question is, can they do this legally? Like, doesn't this go against the First Amendment? And according to the Washington Times article, no, it doesn't. They interviewed Eugene Volokh, a First Amendment expert and law professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, who said, quote, public posts generally pose no legal problems, but when they are private, it can create some potential issues. The government could use information from people to get them fired from their jobs or intimidate people. Residents may also be worried about the monitoring program, so they could be, discouraged from saying certain things related to political speech due to like retaliation. And then it goes on to say, there's always that danger, but there's a danger with all government policing actions. The government is entitled to see what threats are possibly coming down the pike. So according to this article, like they're trying to say that the government's completely entitled to do this, and it's all legal, and it doesn't, go against our First Amendment. And that just, I mean, this does not seem possible to me. Like, I don't agree with that. I think it's going to go to the Supreme Court. Like, don't you think?
Okay, let's do a comparison here. Let's take a look at what's happening currently with the recently introduced Government Surveillance Reform Act. So surprisingly, Democratic Oregon State Senator Ron Wyden is questioning the legality of something called Hemisphere Project. Actually, it's now called Data Analytical Services. And what this is a massive government surveillance program that is once again in the news. If you're not familiar with it, DAS is a surveillance program that allows federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies to access and retrieve trillions of phone records of Americans. And the program is supposed to be focused on drug-related offenses, but reportedly, phone records are often accessed without a warrant, and even when the person is not suspected of a crime. So not only does it keep a log of the caller's details, but anyone on the other end of the phone that the caller's talking to, even if that person has no suspicious links to any kind of illegal activity. And so apparently the White House has been paying AT&T for these phone records since 2009 to the cost of around $6 million, but it hasn't been direct funding. So the money comes through like this series of obscure grants, and that's how the program skips like mandatory federal privacy reviews. So I read an article in SlashGear, and they said, quote, AT&T receives indirect financial grants from the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy. But right from the start, there were red flags about its constitutional legality. Wyden says the program has skirted around the mandatory federal privacy impact assessment due to its odd funding system. The ONDCP doesn't provide direct funding. Instead, it channels the money to a coalition of federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies that goes by the name Houston High Area Drug Trafficking Area, otherwise known as HIDTA, HIDTA. This body directly pays AT&T to build a vast surveillance net spanning the entire country with little oversight, end quote. And so side note to this, I'm familiar with HIDTA because I took several HIDTA classes when I was a cop, and they actually offer like really great training, especially when it comes to stuff like surveillance and undercover operations. But I didn't know they were involved at this level with like a federal surveillance program. And AT&T reportedly saves around 4 billion call logs a day. And the DEA is referring to this as, quote, Google on steroids and AT&T's super search engine, end quote. And so according to Senator Wyden, All the records for this surveillance program were put behind something called law enforcement sensitive protection to ensure that this program wouldn't be public knowledge. So it wasn't on the public's radar until the New York Times exposed it back in 2013, which is when Obama changed the name from Hemisphere Project to DAS. And I read an article in The Blaze that was talking about Obama reportedly like suspended the program briefly, but really all he did was like hide it by changing the name. And then a White House memo showed that local law enforcement agencies were still directly in contact with AT&T to collect phone record data. And then they funneled it. And then funding through the program, I guess Trump actually funded it as well. And then Biden is funding it now. So why am I talking about this and why is this suddenly in the news? Well, Senator Wyden recently wrote a letter to Attorney Merrick Garland questioning the program's legality. And he stated, quote, "I have serious concerns about the legality of this surveillance program, and the materials provided by the DOJ contain troubling information that would justifiably outrage many Americans and other members of Congress. What's truly terrifying is the scale here, as law enforcement authorities have access to call records dating all the way back to 1987, end quote. So circling back to your question about legality and what Hochul's trying to do in New York, on one hand, I'm like all for surveillance of drug trafficking and like stopping potential terrorism, but there's a fine line between that and violating people's constitutional rights. And what it comes down to is that this DAS program and what Hochul wants to do in New York both have like very far-reaching efforts that basically are going to allow the government to spy on American citizens who aren't criminals. And what is that? That's a police state. And so I know we're talking about like the United States, and I know this episode was mostly centered around New York, but I'm going to bring up something else because there is a pretty serious global censorship plan on the horizon. And it's really very concerning because the timing of this whole plan in New York is, quote, coincidental with the United Nations plan to regulate social media and online communication. So just this past weekend, an article came out in the Epoch Times about how the UN recently released a 59-page report this month that outlines a series of, quote, concrete measures which must be implemented by all stakeholders, governments, regulatory authorities, civil society, and the platforms themselves, end quote, in order to crack down on what the UN describes as false information and conspiracy theories, while at the same time promoting their objectives of cultural diversity and gender equality. So the plan is to create a, quote, internet of trust, end quote. And what this is supposed to do is target like misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, and conspiracy theories. So according to the article, quote, examples of expression flagged to be stopped or restricted include concerns about elections, public health measures, and advocacy that could constitute incitement to discrimination, end quote. And Stephanie, I guess that would be the end of our podcast. But
that's crazy. Like that's like so vague too. Like they could do anything they want with that.
Oh no, it's even crazier because just so you guys understand what I'm saying here, this would be a global censorship policy for all members of UNESCO. That's the United Nations Educational, Cultural, and Scientific Organization. And guess who became a member of UNESCO in July of this year? The United States, thanks to the Biden administration. So we have been a member of UNESCO in the past, but both Reagan and Trump took us out of UNESCO because they were concerned about its extremism and its hostility to American values and like some other myriad of problems. So how coincidental that the Biden administration that basically coined the terms disinformation and misinformation over the past few years and has been using propaganda to mislead Americans and the way they enforced the lockdowns during the pandemic, the whole thing with the stolen election. And they just happen to have the United States rejoin a global organization that has the same authoritarian goals. Like, that's frightening. And As the Epic Times article stated, quote, unlike the First Amendment to the US Constitution prohibiting any governmental infringement on the right to free speech or free press, UNESCO points to various international human rights instruments that it says should determine what speech to infringe on. In a recent review of the United States, a UN Human Rights Committee called for changes to the US Constitution and demanded that the US government do more to stop and punish hate speech in order to comply with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which states that restricting freedom of expression must be provided for by law and must also serve a legitimate aim. Another key UN instrument is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states explicitly in Article 29 that rights and freedoms may in no case be exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. End quote. So again, why is this so fucking frightening? Because we are now part of UNESCO and our government has clearly already infringed on the First Amendment. And then you have the director of UNESCO. She's a former French cultural minister with the Socialist Party named Aubrey Azoulay. And she has publicly stated that stopping certain forms of speech and at the same time preserving freedom of expression is not a contradiction. That's called communism. And according to the plan details, once content is found online that UNESCO believes should be restricted, social media platforms are going to be required to take measures very similar to what we've already seen here with the Biden administration with shadow banning and removing content. But this takes it further because the report states, quote, any digital platforms found not to be dealing with content that could be permissibly restricted under international human rights law should be held accountable with enforcement measures, end quote. So again, Stephanie, this is fucking communism. And the Biden administration is saying that they weren't involved in creating this plan. Like, I believe that for 1 second. Absolutely not.
Oh, yeah. And it just happens to all coincide with one of the biggest elections coming up in history. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the US State Department has stated that they are, quote, going to reserve comment until we finish carefully studying the plan, end quote. Like, this is some scary shit. This is essentially a one global police state plan.
Yeah. This is crazy. And you know what really pisses me off is like they go to these great lengths to surveil people and censor people, which we saw with the Twitter files. It was almost always people on the right, never people on the left. So they could do that. Like they could put a guy in prison for posting a meme about Hillary Clinton. Yet there are so many child predators that every day, I mean, they never get caught and they never seem to catch them. They never seem to catch the terrorists. They never seem to catch the migrants with records that are coming into the country. So like that just goes to show the motive behind this. They don't give a shit about the people or about fighting hate crimes. It's all about controlling the narrative. And that is not good for anyone. I don't care if you're on the left and you love Biden. This is not good. It's setting a very dangerous path moving forward. It's like absolutely crazy.
Yeah, and if it's global, like we've seen nothing yet.
Yeah.
And
Oh, and now
and
like with AI that they could
yeah,
have go in there and really monitor things, like it could very quickly get out of hand. It's terrible. It's terrible that they are even considering that, let alone like taking it seriously. Um, well, if that's not bad enough, there's actually more going on with the dictator of New York. Where, you know, she's taking even more action on turning it into a police state. So remember a few months ago when we said how Kathy Hochul was trying to get these like quarantine camps approved and it ended up going to an appeals court? Well, the court finally ruled in favor of Hochul and they're allowing this to move forward, but not just move forward, like they're putting no stipulations whatsoever on it. So, according to an article from davidike.com, the appellate division panel of judges asserted that the plaintiffs, several current and former New York state legislators, and a citizens group did not have legal standing to sue the state, arguing that none of the plaintiffs had sustained personal injury as a result of the regulation. They haven't received any personal injury yet. I mean, that's the whole point. Like, this is scary stuff because what happens is it's giving the state the power to take anyone at any time and place and put them in a facility. And you see these articles that are like debunking it and saying, like, no, it's not really a quarantine camp. Well, what the hell do you call it when they take people suspected of having a disease and place them in a facility? It's a fucking quarantine camp. That's exactly what it is. Now, notice how I said that they can take you if you're suspected of being infected. They don't need proof, they don't need tests, and you don't have any due process. So you could literally show them a negative test and it doesn't matter. You can sue, but no one's like, who are you going to sue? You can't do anything to stop it. There is no legal protection you have. And this is not just for COVID. Like, this is for any disease, even things like Lyme disease, which you can't, give to someone else. That's on the list. And like, Tara, isn't this the same kind of shit that like the Nazis pulled in World War II, where they would take anyone away that was like sick or disabled? And they wanted to take care of like anyone that wasn't in perfect health. And like now New York is doing this. And it's like, that should be a really big red flag for everyone right now, because again, there's no restrictions that the court placed on this, which means they can take a newborn baby. They could take a mother who just gave birth. They could take my toddler, your grandmother, like anyone for any time that's just suspected of disease or infection. Now, like, what will they do to you when they get you to these camps or facilities or whatever they want to call it? Whatever the fuck they want, because once again, there's no restrictions or stipulations. They can give you any medication, any vaccination, even experimental drugs, anything they want, and they can hold you as long as they want, until they think that, whatever. Like they don't even have to give a reason. They can hold you for a day, they could hold you for a month. And once again, no due process. There's no one you can call. There's nothing you can do. No one's going to come save you. So, like, let's look at the worst case scenario. You're a mother that's just given birth and it's suspected that you have COVID or the flu or a freaking cough, like any illness at all. Then they take your baby away and you and your family have no rights whatsoever. They don't have to answer your questions. They don't have to give you any information. Here's another scenario. Let's say your elderly grandmother is costing the system a lot of money for her care, and they take her away because they say, well, she's suspected of having this disease. And then you find out like later that she died in their care and you have no answers, no recourse. Like, this is the kind of shit that they would be allowed to do because there's no regulation whatsoever in what was passed. And like, if this was really about public health and safety, do you really think that they would allow millions of migrants in the country and in New York State that haven't been vaccinated, that could have literally any disease known to man? But no, like, they're welcoming them in. Meanwhile, taxpayers have to be fully vaccinated to attend school. Many places require COVID vaccines and testing to go to school and work. But once again, like, none of these rules apply to the migrants because they don't give a shit about public health. It's not about that. It is about control. And I guarantee that, like, there's going to be some other pandemic that they know about or something where they'll use everyone's fear to take control and then have these insane laws, that they're putting in place. And that'll give them everything they need to do with the people that don't agree with the narrative or that push back. And I guess that New York has one more chance to appeal this, and then that's it. So let's hope that one more appeal goes through.
This is crazy to me. Like, it's crazy that this is not headline news throughout the whole fucking country. I mean, this is exactly what this is the start of fucking Nazism. I mean, we're already seeing that in our country anyway, but the extremism of this ability to just basically make shit up and take your family away or take you away if they don't like what you're doing or saying. Like, this is straight up hardcore communism. And I'm sorry, I just went to Hungary for the weekend and did a whole communist tour, and it was scary as fuck what they did to these people. And now we are literally seeing it happening in our own country, and it's fucking frightening. But as far as like New York goes, this should come as no surprise, but there was a new study done by the Cato Institute that just ranked New York dead last in their annual study of all 50 states when it comes to determining the most free state in America. So the 48th worst state is Hawaii. I'm sorry, 49th worst is Hawaii, and 48th worst is California. So no surprises there either. But the ranking criteria includes policies that impact economic, social, and personal freedoms. And New York is the worst state in the country. And Fox News reported that by comparison, Florida was ranked number 2 and was surpassed only by New Hampshire as being the most free state in America, which I thought that was surprising with New Hampshire. But totally not surprising is that New York has apparently been the least free state in every version of the index and every year covered by the report since the year 2000. Like, how is any sane, rational person still fucking living in New York? I don't understand. And now with this new ability to basically imprison people in their quarantine camps, like, get the fuck out of New York.
Well, and here's the thing too that I was thinking about, because like I said, this is not all over the news. Like, I
No.
had to dig to find out that this passed. And same with when they were going through the hearings, like very few people reported on it. So they're totally like trying to control what's getting out, and they're banking on most people like not knowing this. It's going to fly under the radar. And then like think about it. If there's another COVID event, which they're already telling us there's going to be, like they're flat out saying they'll go under lockdown just like they did before. And then they're going to bank again that no one's going to know what's happening. No one's going to know that a bunch of their neighbors have been hauled off to a quarantine camp because you're under lockdown. They're surveilling social media, the internet, phone calls, all the things we just talked about. That's what they're banking on, just like Hitler did. No one knew like about what was happening for a while. I mean, it was a while before people understood the severity of it. And so I feel like the same mistakes are being made again, and no one's
And
really
that's
blowing the whistle on this.
No, and that's why the idea of a global censorship plan is so fucking concerning, because the only way we know what's going on in other countries is because of our ability to communicate through social media and
Yep.
online platforms. And so if there is a global move to basically have the United Nations determine what is and is not to be censored in combination with all this shit, I mean, it's just, this is real. It's so scary that most people don't understand the severity of what's happening right now.
Yeah. I'm so glad I don't live in New York right now.
Yeah.
But I mean, that doesn't really say a lot. Like, if there's a global plan in place, then it really doesn't matter, you know?
No, no.
So yeah, that was a terrifying episode. Sorry to leave everyone with that, but it's like, again, I think we have to know what's going on because we have to speak out about it. Like, if everyone's just afraid and like doesn't say anything and goes along with it, that's how this continues to happen. Like, we've got to share this news. If the news media is not talking about it, who gives a fuck? Like, we have social media, we have podcasts. We need to like call them out on this and stand up against it, because if we don't,
Well, we can.
yeah, while we can,
Well,
exactly.
we can.
Oh my gosh, we're probably getting flagged as we speak. We're on an FBI list somewhere.
We have been.
Well, we'll keep everyone posted on that whole story. I mean, there's never a dull moment in New York these days. So we'll keep you updated. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you back here on Friday. If you're sick of all the crazy shit going on in our country and you want to express your support and patriotism for the show, head on over to our Etsy store at UO Patriot Chicks and check out our new stickers. The link can also be found on our website. If you love the show and you want exclusive episodes, support the podcast and join the conversation by becoming a member of our Patreon community. We'll be posting weekly member-only podcast episodes and content that isn't available on the weekly podcast. Every Patreon member will also get a free Unapologetically Outspoken sticker and updates about our new sticker release before they're made public. And be sure to follow us on TikTok at Unapologetically Outspoken. And if you haven't done so already, please rate and review the podcast. The more you support us, the more people we can reach. So help us spread the word.